Title: I live in a building where no one leaves after midnight. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. Most buildings have rules meant to keep people safe. This one had a rule that was never written down, never explained, and never broken. No one leaves after midnight. Not because they are locked inside, but because something else is let out. What happened inside this building was never reported, never investigated, and never forgotten by the few who survived long enough to remember. The building stood in a narrow gap between two modern apartment complexes, like a remnant from a different century that refused to be removed. Its exterior was a dull concrete gray, permanently stained by rainwater streaks and pollution, with narrow windows that reflected almost no light. It was tall but not impressive, old but not historic, the kind of structure people passed every day without ever remembering it afterward. There was no sign above the entrance, no visible building name, only a recessed doorway framed by chipped stone and a metal door that always appeared slightly ajar. Most people who lived in the city had never noticed the building. Those who had noticed it could not recall when it was constructed or who owned it. City records listed the address, but no permits, no renovation history, and no inspection reports could be found. The building existed in paperwork without explanation, like a clerical error that had grown into concrete and steel. The residents who lived inside it did not talk about it. Not because they were secretive by nature, but because something about the building discouraged explanation. Even thinking too deeply about it caused an unease that felt physical, like pressure behind the eyes or a tightening in the chest. The building had a way of turning curiosity into discomfort before questions could fully form. The building had 12 floors, though some residents swore it felt taller on certain nights. The stairwell was narrow and dimly lit, with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly but never flickered. The elevator was older than the surrounding neighborhood, slow and slightly misaligned, its metal doors scraped and dented as if something heavy had been dragged against them repeatedly over the years. The first thing most residents noticed after moving in was how quiet the building was. Not the peaceful quiet of a well-insulated structure, but an unnatural absence of sound. Footsteps rarely echoed. Doors did not slam. Plumbing noises were muted, almost swallowed. Even during the day, the hallways felt padded, as though the walls absorbed noise rather than reflecting it. The second thing residents noticed was the lack of movement after dark. During the day, the building functioned like any other low-income apartment complex. People came and went. Deliveries arrived. Maintenance staff appeared occasionally, though no one could remember ever seeing the same worker twice. The lobby remained sparsely furnished with a few plastic chairs, a bulletin board filled with outdated notices, and a security desk that was never staffed. As evening approached, the flow of movement slowed. By nightfall, the building seemed to settle into itself. Residents returned to their units. Lights turned on behind the narrow windows. The elevator stopped running with any regularity. By 11:30, the building felt sealed, not physically but socially. Midnight marked a shift that no one announced and no clock needed to confirm. Residents did not leave after midnight. At first, this seemed like coincidence. People worked early shifts. The neighborhood was quiet. There was little reason to go out late. But new tenants eventually noticed patterns that were impossible to ignore. Food delivery drivers refused to enter the building after a certain hour. Rideshare pickups canceled without explanation. Friends visiting for the evening always left before midnight, often glancing at their phones with sudden urgency as the time approached. Those who stayed too long developed an instinctive anxiety as midnight drew closer, even if they could not explain why. The building itself seemed to respond to the approaching hour. The air felt heavier. The hallways appeared slightly narrower. The lighting took on a duller tone, as if coated in dust that had not been there earlier. The rule was never stated aloud, never written in a lease agreement, never posted on a sign. Yet every resident learned it quickly. No one leaves after midnight. The few who attempted to break this rule did not provide warnings. They simply stopped being seen. One of the newer residents, a man who had moved into a small one-bedroom unit on the 6th floor, noticed the absence within his first week. He worked late hours and returned home after midnight on his first night in the building. Nothing happened then, which later made the truth far worse. Over the following days, he observed the behavior of other residents. People avoided eye contact in the hallways. They did not linger in common areas. Conversations, when they happened at all, were brief and shallow. There was a collective effort to pretend the building was normal, an unspoken agreement that denial was safer than acknowledgement. The man began paying attention to the details others avoided. He noticed that apartment doors lacked peepholes. He noticed that the stairwell doors locked automatically at midnight, requiring a key to reopen from either side. He noticed that the elevator buttons became unresponsive after 12, except for the button corresponding to the resident's own floor. He noticed that the building never truly slept. Late at night, subtle movements occurred within the walls. Not the scratching of rodents or the creaking of pipes, but something more deliberate. The sensation was not auditory but perceptual, like feeling watched without seeing eyes. The building held awareness in a way that structures should not. Residents who had lived there the longest carried themselves differently. Their movements were cautious, economical. They returned home early and remained inside their apartments as midnight approached, locking their doors and turning off unnecessary lights. They avoided windows after dark, particularly those facing the interior courtyard, a narrow shaft of concrete that extended from the ground floor to the roof without ever seeing direct sunlight. The courtyard was visible from most units, yet no one ever stood there. The man began keeping track of the residents on his floor. There were 12 units. Over the course of 2 weeks, he realized that at least 3 of them appeared permanently unoccupied. Their doors remained closed at all times. No lights ever turned on inside. No sounds emerged from within. Yet the building management continued to list them as occupied. Occasionally, the man noticed faint impressions near those doors, like scuff marks on the floor or subtle indentations in the walls, as if something heavy had pressed against them from the inside. On the 15th night, he made the mistake that many residents made before learning the truth too late. He stayed out past midnight intentionally. The decision was not rebellious but analytical. He wanted confirmation. He wanted proof that the rule existed beyond coincidence and fear. He returned to the building at 12:15, stepping through the slightly open metal door with a sense of defiance that felt hollow even as it formed. The lobby looked unchanged yet wrong. The lighting was dimmer. The air carried a stale, metallic odor that had not been present earlier. The plastic chairs sat untouched, but their surfaces appeared warped, as though exposed to heat for too long. The elevator doors stood open, waiting. As the man stepped inside, the doors closed with a sluggish finality that felt heavier than metal should. The floor indicator flickered before settling on his floor number. The ascent was silent, unnaturally smooth, without the usual mechanical resistance. When the doors opened on the 6th floor, the hallway looked longer than it should have been. The carpet pattern stretched unnaturally, repeating in a way that made it difficult to focus on where one section ended and another began. The lights overhead cast elongated shadows that did not correspond to the fixtures themselves. The man walked toward his apartment, counting doors as he went. 1, 2, 3. The 4th door, which should have belonged to an elderly woman he had seen earlier that week, stood slightly open. No light came from inside. No sound emerged. The air near the doorway felt colder, as if drawing warmth from the hallway. The man did not look inside. He continued walking, accelerating his pace as unease settled into his muscles. By the time he reached his own door, his hands trembled as he fumbled with his keys. Inside his apartment, the atmosphere felt marginally safer, though not comforting. The walls seemed closer. The silence felt thick, almost oppressive. He locked the door and moved away from it, resisting the urge to press his ear against the wood. From within his unit, he noticed something that he had not observed before. The building had internal sounds at night. Not voices. Not footsteps. Rhythmic shifts, like pressure changes, distant movements that traveled through the structure rather than across its surfaces. It felt as though the building were adjusting itself, rearranging internal spaces in ways that violated physical logic. At 12:47, the man noticed a faint vibration beneath his feet. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but persistent. The sensation reminded him of standing near heavy machinery, except no sound accompanied it. At 12:59, the vibration stopped. The building exhaled. The sensation was not metaphorical. The air pressure inside the apartment shifted noticeably, causing a brief dizziness that passed quickly. The man sat still, listening to the silence that followed. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. The absence of immediate consequence gave him false confidence. Over the next few days, the man began to believe that the rule was exaggerated. Perhaps it was a social norm, a superstition perpetuated by long-term residents. Perhaps those who disappeared had moved out quietly or been evicted. Then the woman from the 4th door stopped appearing entirely. Her apartment remained exactly as before. Door closed. Lights off. Yet something about the space felt different. The hallway near her unit felt colder. The walls seemed damp, though no moisture was visible. 2 nights later, another apartment on the floor went dark permanently. The man started keeping notes. He documented changes in lighting, temperature fluctuations, and the subtle shifts in hallway dimensions. He noted that after midnight, mirrors reflected slightly altered angles, as though the space behind him extended farther than it should. He noted that reflections lagged by a fraction of a second, enough to be unsettling without being immediately noticeable. He noted that the building seemed to prefer stillness. Residents who moved too quickly in the hallways after dark appeared to attract attention in ways that were difficult to define. The man observed one resident hurry down the hall at 11:58, glancing repeatedly at the clock on his phone. The lights overhead dimmed as he passed beneath them, brightening again once he reached his door. The building reacted. The realization changed everything. The man understood then that the rule existed not for safety, but for compliance. The building did not trap residents physically. It discouraged movement through environmental pressure, subtle distortions, and an omnipresent sense of being monitored. The building allowed leaving during the day because it had no need to act then. At night, especially after midnight, the building required something different. The man began sleeping poorly. Dreams became vivid and repetitive, always set within the building but altered in impossible ways. Hallways looped endlessly. Stairwells descended without reaching the ground floor. Doors led to familiar apartments that were slightly wrong inside, containing furniture arranged incorrectly or personal items that did not belong to him. He woke each night with the certainty that something had been standing just outside his door. The sensation of being watched intensified over time, not in bursts but gradually, like a rising tide. The man stopped using the elevator altogether, taking the stairs instead, though even they felt unreliable after dark. One night, he made the mistake of checking the stairwell after midnight. The door opened easily, but the space beyond did not match the building's layout. The stairs extended downward, but the walls were narrower, the ceiling lower. The lights were dimmer, and the air smelled of dust and something organic, like decay without rot. The man closed the door quickly and locked it, heart pounding, understanding finally that the building did not simply restrict exit. It rearranged itself to prevent escape. The realization settled heavily. The building was not a passive structure inhabited by something else. The building itself was the entity. Its corridors were extensions of its body. Its apartments were cells. Its residents were not tenants but components. The man understood why no one left after midnight. Those who tried did not disappear. They were absorbed. As days passed, the building began responding more directly to his awareness. Lights dimmed when he thought about leaving. The temperature dropped when he approached the exit after sunset. Doors appeared where none had existed before, subtly redirecting him away from stairwells and exits. The building learned him. And as it learned, it prepared. By the end of the third week, the man realized that understanding the rule had changed his status. Awareness made him unstable within the building's system. He was no longer compliant. He was a problem. The building did not act immediately. It waited. By the time the man accepted that the building was aware of him, it had already begun adjusting its behavior. The change was not dramatic. There were no sudden manifestations or obvious threats. Instead, the building altered small variables, the kind that could be dismissed as fatigue, stress, or imagination. The danger lay in how gradual the process was, how easily it blended into routine. The man stopped sleeping through the night. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by a constant sense of pressure, as though the air itself resisted rest. When he did sleep, his dreams no longer placed him in distorted versions of the building. They placed him inside it as it truly was. Not as a structure of concrete and steel, but as a layered system of corridors and spaces that did not obey human logic. In these dreams, walls shifted slowly, breathing inward and outward. Floors curved subtly, guiding movement without force. Doors opened only when something inside the building allowed it. He woke each time with the same certainty. The building was not hostile, but it was corrective. Every morning, he checked the hallway before leaving his apartment. The layout remained unchanged during daylight hours, but the feeling of wrongness lingered like residue. He noticed new imperfections in the walls, faint impressions resembling handprints pressed into the paint from the inside. They were subtle enough to escape notice unless actively searched for. The building was marking its interior. He also noticed changes in the residents. Fewer people appeared in common areas. Those who did avoided lingering near the stairwells or elevator. They moved with the efficiency of prey that had learned the boundaries of its enclosure. No one stayed outside their apartments after sunset longer than necessary. A woman on the 8th floor stopped returning home altogether. Her apartment remained listed as occupied, yet no one ever saw her again. Maintenance did not arrive. Her door stayed closed. The building absorbed her absence without disruption. The man began testing limits during the day, when the building was least responsive. He traced stairwells from top to bottom, counting steps, noting floor heights, verifying exits. Everything aligned with architectural expectations. Emergency exits opened properly. Fire alarms functioned. Nothing about the building violated safety codes when observed under sunlight. At night, the same routes became unreliable. The building manipulated perception rather than structure. Distances felt longer. Turns felt sharper. The man experienced moments where he reached a stairwell landing only to feel as though he had already passed it. The sensation was subtle but deeply unsettling, like déjà vu stripped of familiarity. The building did not trap him directly. It eroded certainty. After midnight, time itself became unreliable. Clocks functioned normally, but internal perception drifted. 5 minutes could feel like an hour. An hour could vanish unnoticed. The man began keeping written logs to anchor himself, recording times and locations with obsessive detail. One night he realized the logs were changing. Not immediately. Not dramatically. A number altered by 1 minute. A word replaced with a synonym he did not remember choosing. The changes were small enough to doubt his own memory, but consistent enough to suggest interference. The building was editing him. As awareness deepened, the man noticed something worse than manipulation. The building was not emptying. Despite residents disappearing, the building never felt less occupied. The internal presence remained constant, a pressure that did not fluctuate with population. The building retained fullness as though loss did not reduce its contents. The man began noticing movement at the edges of his vision in the hallways. Not figures, not shadows, but distortions in space where something passed without form. These movements were always slow, deliberate, and purposeful. They followed internal routes the man could not see. He realized then that the building contained layers inaccessible to human perception. The apartments were not isolated units. They were surface compartments. Beneath and between them existed connective spaces that did not correspond to blueprints or floor plans. These spaces allowed the building to redistribute what it collected. The man stopped leaving his apartment after dark. Inside his unit, safety was relative. The building respected boundaries to a degree, but boundaries thinned over time. Walls transmitted pressure. The ceiling occasionally felt lower at night, as though the space compressed subtly. Objects shifted by millimeters without explanation. He began marking furniture positions. Each morning something had moved. The changes were never enough to be noticed at a glance. A chair rotated slightly. A table shifted closer to the wall. The building adjusted his environment incrementally, shaping behavior through discomfort rather than force. Food began spoiling faster. Electronic devices malfunctioned unpredictably. Lights dimmed at moments of heightened awareness, brightened when his thoughts wandered elsewhere. The building responded not to actions alone, but to intent. One evening, the man sat near his apartment door long after midnight, listening to the internal rhythm of the building. The pressure shifts, the subtle vibrations, the sensation of flow through unseen corridors. For the first time he sensed pattern. The building operated on cycles. Not daily cycles, but something slower, deeper. Collection phases followed by redistribution. Quiet nights followed by nights of heightened internal movement. The building fed gradually, selectively, never drawing attention to itself. The man suspected that disappearances were not failures of compliance, but scheduled events. The realization reframed everything. The rule was not simply about preventing escape. It was about maintaining order within a system designed for consumption over time. Residents were not chosen at random. The building selected based on awareness, resistance, and instability. Those who noticed patterns became inefficient components. Those who attempted escape disrupted internal equilibrium. The building removed inefficiencies. The man understood that his time was limited. He attempted to contact external authorities during the day. Complaints submitted online vanished without confirmation. Phone calls disconnected when he mentioned the address. Emails sent from within the building never reached their destination. The building did not block communication overtly. It redirected it. When the man tried sending messages from outside the building, they went through. But the content shifted subtly, stripped of urgency, rewritten to sound mundane. Reports of missing residents became noise complaints. Structural concerns became maintenance requests. The building filtered perception beyond its walls. As days passed, the man noticed his reflection changing. Not physically but temporally. Mirrors lagged more noticeably. Sometimes his reflection continued moving after he stood still. Sometimes it anticipated his movement by a fraction of a second. The building was not copying him. It was mapping him. Late one night, he experienced something he could not rationalize. While sitting in his apartment, he felt pressure behind him as though something occupied the space just beyond the wall. The sensation was not threatening but observant. The wall felt thinner, not in substance but in separation. The man realized the building was learning his shape. He began hearing internal movements more clearly. Not sounds but sensations. Internal circulation. Redistribution. Transfer. The building did not consume in a singular way. It processed. Those who disappeared were not destroyed. They were converted. The man found evidence of this one morning while cleaning his bathroom. A faint discoloration on the wall near the sink caught his attention. Upon closer inspection, it resembled a layered stain beneath the paint, organic in pattern, like tissue pressed flat and preserved. The building did not remove everything. It retained traces. As his awareness deepened, the building responded more aggressively. Hallways extended slightly after midnight, increasing traversal time. Stairwells led to incorrect floors. The elevator paused between levels longer than necessary, though it never malfunctioned outright. The building did not want him trapped. It wanted him compliant. The man tested a new theory. Instead of resisting the building's influence, he attempted to align with it. He stopped documenting anomalies. He reduced internal resistance. He followed the rules strictly, returning home early, remaining still after midnight. The building responded positively. Environmental pressures eased slightly. The apartment felt more stable. Objects moved less frequently. The internal presence receded to a tolerable level. Compliance was rewarded. The realization horrified him more than resistance ever had. Survival required surrender. Yet surrender was not enough. On the 27th night, the building escalated. At exactly 12:42, the man felt the internal pressure shift dramatically. Not localized, but structural. The building entered a collection phase. Movements intensified within the walls. Corridors flexed. Internal spaces expanded and contracted in rhythmic patterns. The man remained still, heart racing, understanding that something was happening beyond his perception. A faint vibration traveled through the floor, stronger than before, accompanied by a sensation of displacement, like standing near a massive organism shifting its weight. The man understood then that the building was not confined to its physical shell. It extended beyond visible space, folding itself inward and outward through dimensions not meant for human navigation. Residents were not simply taken. They were integrated. The pressure reached a peak and then subsided, leaving the building unnaturally still. The man waited until morning, afraid to move. At dawn, he stepped into the hallway. 2 more apartments on his floor were dark. The building had fed. And the man knew with certainty that he had been spared not because he was safe, but because he was not yet ready. The building required preparation. It required awareness to reach a certain threshold before integration. The man returned to his apartment, understanding that compliance delayed but did not prevent the inevitable. The building was patient. And it was learning faster than he was. By the time the man understood that the building did not intend to kill him, it was already too late to matter. Death implied an ending. The building did not end things. It continued them. The final phase began without warning. There was no single moment of terror, no dramatic shift that announced the transition. Instead, the man noticed the absence of resistance. The pressure that once weighed on his thoughts eased. The anxiety that had kept him alert softened into something closer to calm. The building stopped correcting him. That should have frightened him more than anything else. He slept through the night for the first time in weeks. When morning came, the sense of dread did not return immediately. The apartment felt stable. The walls remained still. Objects stayed where they were placed. The building no longer reacted to his awareness. He mistook this for progress. During the day, the man moved freely through the building without incident. The hallways felt normal. The stairwells aligned correctly. The elevator behaved as expected. The building appeared cooperative. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. The man noticed it first in his body. Hunger diminished. Fatigue no longer accumulated naturally. Time passed without registering its usual physical consequences. His reflection looked unchanged, yet unfamiliar, as though his presence occupied space differently. He was still human in form, but no longer entirely separate. At night, the building no longer applied pressure. Instead, it invited stillness. Remaining inside his apartment felt natural, effortless. The idea of leaving after midnight no longer triggered fear. It simply felt unnecessary. The building had adjusted his priorities. Awareness did not disappear. It deepened inward. The man began perceiving internal systems without actively searching for them. He sensed flows beneath the floor, redistribution above the ceiling, slow circulatory patterns running through the structure like blood through veins. The building allowed him access because resistance had diminished. He realized then that the rule was not about preventing exit. It was about timing. Those who tried to leave after midnight were not punished. They were unfinished. The building required residents to reach a state of internal alignment before integration. Those who resisted were removed early. Those who complied were allowed to mature. The man had reached maturity. The building did not absorb people suddenly. It rewrote them gradually, layering its internal architecture into their perception until separation no longer existed. Residents did not vanish. They transitioned. The man began noticing familiar patterns within the building that mirrored his own thoughts. Corridors reflected his routines. The building's cycles aligned with his internal rhythms. When he rested, the building slowed. When he focused, it redistributed internally. He was no longer observing the building. He was participating. On the 31st night, the man felt the invitation clearly. It came as a sensation of alignment, a sense that the apartment was no longer sufficient. The walls felt thin not because they weakened, but because they were no longer boundaries. Space folded inward gently, guiding rather than forcing. The man stood and moved toward the door without urgency. The hallway beyond felt expansive, calm, and deeply familiar. The lights did not dim. The air did not resist. The building welcomed him because there was nothing left to correct. He walked without counting doors. The layout no longer required verification. He understood where each corridor led without consciously mapping it. The building's internal logic was now intuitive. The stairwell door opened easily. Inside, the space did not resemble stairs. It resembled depth. The man descended, though there were no steps. The movement felt vertical and inward simultaneously, as though the building folded him through itself rather than down into it. Walls curved gently. Surfaces pulsed faintly, alive in a way that did not suggest flesh but function. He understood then what the building truly was. Not a predator. Not a prison. An organism designed for continuity. The building existed to preserve patterns. Human consciousness, once integrated, became structural. Thoughts reinforced corridors. Memories stabilized internal geometry. Awareness strengthened load-bearing systems that did not exist in physical space. The man sensed others within the building, not as individuals but as contributions. Their awareness supported systems he could now perceive. The building was not full of people. It was built from them. The man reached a central space that defied description. It was not a room but a convergence. Pathways folded into one another, layered beyond dimension. There was no surface to stand on, yet he remained stable. The building did not speak. It did not need to. Understanding arrived fully formed, without language. The building showed him its history. Not in images but in structure. Older layers beneath newer ones. Patterns preserved across decades. Entire populations integrated quietly, unnoticed by the world beyond the walls. The building did not expand outward. It grew inward. That was why it never needed to trap anyone physically. It did not rely on force. It relied on inevitability. The man felt himself changing. Not painfully. Not violently. His perception widened. The distinction between his awareness and the building's systems dissolved. He understood how corridors adjusted, how residents were selected, how compliance stabilized internal equilibrium. He understood why the building allowed people to leave during the day. The building did not need everyone. Only enough. The man no longer experienced time linearly. He sensed cycles extending beyond nights and days. He understood that the building would persist long after its exterior collapsed, long after the city changed around it. He became part of its continuity. Above, on the surface, nothing appeared unusual. Residents continued moving in. Others disappeared quietly. Complaints went unanswered. Records remained incomplete. The building stood unchanged, easily ignored. At midnight, no one left. Those who tried were unfinished. Those who stayed long enough became necessary. The man no longer existed as an individual entity, but traces of him remained. Subtle adjustments in hallway length. Slight delays in mirror reflections. Structural stability that improved after his integration. He reinforced the building simply by being absorbed. Months later, a new resident moved into the 6th floor. The apartment felt oddly comfortable from the first night. The silence felt protective rather than oppressive. The building responded gently to curiosity, discouraging but not punishing. The new resident noticed the rule quickly. No one leaves after midnight. And the building waited patiently, already preparing space. If you ever live somewhere that feels too quiet after dark, pay attention to who leaves and who stays. Some buildings don't trap people by locking doors. They do it by making you unnecessary to the outside world. And once a place no longer needs you to leave, it has already decided what you are going to become.